It was just another busy afternoon in the city, with the usual hustle and bustle of pedestrians weaving in and out of storefronts, cars honking, and street musicians playing their tunes. Among the noise and the chaos, Sophie Carter sat at her makeshift art stand, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her paintings. The small wooden table before her was an oasis of color amidst the grayness of the sidewalk. Soft blues and fiery oranges blended together in abstract forms. Each canvas had a story, a piece of Sophie's soul poured into it, but no one seemed to notice. Sophie had been sitting there for hours watching people walk by, some pausing for a split second to glance at her work before moving on. A woman in a navy blazer stopped for just a moment, admiring a piece, but then shook her head and walked away, probably thinking it was overpriced or out of her taste. A man in a sharp suit glanced at the sign in front of her booth, "Original Art Funding, My Cancer Treatment," and his eyes hardened before he turned and walked off without a word. Sophie didn't blame them. She understood. People had their own lives, their own problems. They were just passing by, not noticing the girl with the paintings who was fighting to survive, fighting for a chance to live. She swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to surface. She wasn't supposed to be weak. She wasn't supposed to let the exhaustion, the sickness, the constant struggle get to her. But sitting there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the midday sun, she couldn't help but feel invisible. Her mother had helped her set up the stand that morning, but it had been Sophie's idea. Painting had always been her escape, her refuge ever since she was a little girl. But now it was more than just a passion. It was her lifeline. If she could sell enough paintings, if people saw value in what she created, maybe she could afford the treatment that could save her life. She glanced at the small stack of canvases, each one a piece of her heart, and then looked around, feeling a wave of frustration wash over her. What if no one bought anything? What if she couldn't even make enough for her next round of chemo? What if it wasn't enough to save her? Sophie shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. She wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. Not when so much was riding on this. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Sophie forced a smile when an elderly couple approached her stand. The woman, a small lady with silver hair and a soft smile, ran her fingers lightly over the edge of a canvas. Sophie's heart pounded. "These are beautiful," the woman murmured, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Sophie's chest tightened. Could this be it? Could she finally sell something? "How much for this one?" the woman asked, gesturing to a painting of a desert sky, deep purples and golds bleeding together. Sophie almost couldn't believe it. Her voice caught in her throat as she answered, $80. The couple exchanged a glance, and Sophie held her breath. Finally, the woman nodded. "We'll take it." For a moment, Sophie stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. She hadn't expected it. Not like this. Her first sale. The first sign that maybe, just maybe, this would work. She handed the woman the painting, her hands shaking as she tucked it carefully into a paper bag. The couple walked away, their steps slow and deliberate, and Sophie was left standing there, $80 in hand, her heart racing. Maybe she wasn't just a girl selling art on a sidewalk. Maybe she was more than that. Hope surged inside her. She could do this. She would do this. And just as she began to regain her focus, a shadow fell over her stand, interrupting her thoughts. A man had approached. His weathered cowboy hat and thick coat stood out against the sharp, clean lines of the businessmen and tourists who passed her by. He took a long look at the paintings in front of her before turning his eyes to Sophie, who was still struggling to contain her emotions. "Well, kid," the man said, his voice rough, "nice work, but you're going to need more than some paintings to get by, you know?" Sophie blinked, confused, not sure if he was just another passerby or someone genuinely interested in her art. But the man didn't stop there. "You should try selling prints or, I don't know, get on TikTok or something. People don't buy real art anymore." Sophie's heart dropped. She had heard it before. People who didn't understand. People who thought they knew better. She forced a smile, her hands clenched tightly, but she was determined not to let his words affect her. "Thank you for the advice," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man scoffed, shaking his head, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Sophie sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had stood. And then, without warning, a figure appeared in front of her stand. A figure that would change everything. Clint Eastwood. The familiar face, the quiet strength that exuded from every inch of him, stood in front of Sophie's table. He looked at her paintings, taking in each one with the same calm, thoughtful expression that had made him a legend. But it wasn't his fame or his reputation that caught Sophie's attention. It was the way he looked at her, the way he looked at her art, as if it mattered, as if she mattered. The city's hum seemed to fade away as Clint Eastwood stood before Sophie's small stand. The noise of passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the clinking of coins, all of it blurred into the background. In that moment, it was just him and her. The world, for a brief second, came to a stillness. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him before, of course, on the screen, in movies. But this was different. This wasn't a Hollywood icon in a role. This was Clint Eastwood, standing in front of her, quietly studying her paintings. He took his time, eyeing each canvas, his expression unreadable. Sophie held her breath, waiting. Every part of her wanted to reach out, to say something, but words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say to someone like him? After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, and deliberate, like a man who had learned the art of silence long ago. "Nice work," he said, his eyes lingering on the painting of the desert sky, the one that had been sold earlier that day. "What's the story behind this one?" Sophie blinked, her pulse quickening. She had never expected someone like him to stop, let alone ask. But there he was, his weathered face calm, yet somehow kind, looking at her work with an intensity that made her heart race. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. It's about fighting back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fighting against everything that tries to pull you down. The world, your own body. It's my story." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I'm raising money for my treatment. The next round of chemo it's expensive. My family can't afford it anymore." There was a long pause. For a moment, it felt like he was weighing her words, like he was searching for something deeper. Sophie couldn't tell if he understood or if he was simply humoring her, but she pressed on, driven by an urgent need to be heard. "I've always painted," she continued, the words flowing more easily now. "But I never thought it would be this. I never thought I'd be here, selling my paintings just to survive. But it's all I have left." Clint's eyes softened, just a fraction. He nodded slowly, as though processing the weight of her words. Then, without a word, he reached out and picked up the painting of the desert sky. He examined it, turning it slightly in the light, as though finding something familiar in it, something personal. Sophie held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. Was he going to criticize it, laugh, or maybe walk away like the others? But he didn't. After a moment, Clint looked at her, his eyes locking with hers. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence between them spoke volumes. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy. It was something else, something real. Then, without missing a beat, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. Sophie stared, wide-eyed, as he counted out $80, exactly the amount she had asked for the painting. "You've got something here," Clint said, his voice steady. "Keep going." Sophie felt the ground shift beneath her feet. It wasn't just the money, it was the way he looked at her, the way he saw her. For the first time in days, maybe even weeks, she felt like she wasn't invisible. Her hands were trembling as she took the money, but there was a spark inside her now, a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just painting to survive anymore. She was painting to prove something. To herself, to everyone who had told her she couldn't. Clint handed her the cash and nodded toward the painting. "I'll take it," he said simply. "Keep going." As he turned to walk away, Sophie felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. He didn't linger. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He simply bought the painting and left, like it was the most normal thing in the world. But to Sophie, it felt like a turning point, a moment she would never forget. This was more than just a sale. It was validation. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, There were people who saw you, not as a victim, but as a fighter. The weight of the $80 in her hand felt different now. It wasn't just cash. It was a lifeline. It was hope. And as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Sophie sat back down at her table, her eyes fixed on the crowd moving past her. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not to Clint Eastwood, and maybe, just maybe, not to the world either. The next person who stopped might be the one to change everything. But for now, she had one painting sold, and that was a start. And that was enough to keep fighting. The next few hours passed in a blur. Sophie sat at her booth, her gaze drifting between the bustling sidewalk and the canvas she had just sold. Clint Eastwood's visit had left her in a state of disbelief, yet it was a feeling of disbelief she welcomed. Her hands still trembled, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from something else. It was the rush of possibility. She had sold a painting to someone who mattered. It wasn't just the money. The $80 was helpful, of course, but the real value was in the act itself, the validation. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her life than just the struggle, the treatments, the pain. Maybe her art could be her salvation. Sophie glanced at the empty space next to her booth where the desert sky painting had once hung. It felt like a piece of herself had left with it. She smiled softly to herself. That painting, once a symbol of her own fight, now carried someone else's story, someone else's interpretation. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with it. The crowd around her seemed indifferent at first, just as it had been all afternoon. But Sophie no longer felt like a small part of the backdrop. She felt like a part of something larger, something that was finally beginning to make sense. An older man, his face lined with age and experience, stopped in front of her stand. He was wearing a faded leather jacket, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Sophie recognized. But unlike the others who glanced at her work out of curiosity or pity, this man seemed genuinely interested. His gaze lingered on the paintings in front of him, studying each one as though looking for something more than just brushstrokes. "These are good," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but firm. Sophie looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady now. The panic and uncertainty she had felt before were gone. The man ran a hand through his graying hair and took a step closer. "How much for this one?" he asked, pointing to another painting, one Sophie had been particularly proud of. It was an abstract piece, full of bold reds, blues, and blacks, a storm in the middle of an ocean. She hadn't thought anyone would buy it. It was too chaotic, too much of a departure from the calm landscapes that had become her signature. But there was something about the way the man looked at it that made her pause. His eyes softened as if he understood the turbulence behind it. $80, Sophie said, her voice quiet but sure. He hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his options. Then, with a small nod, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "I'll take it," he said. "You've got talent, kid. Keep it up." Sophie barely processed his words before he walked off, her second painting sold. The $80 in her hand felt heavier this time. Not just because of the money, but because it symbolized something more. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was creating. She was living. By the time the sun began to set, Sophie had sold 3 more paintings. The crowd was thinning, the streetlights flickering to life, and the air had a slight chill to it. Sophie stood up, stretching her tired limbs, and surveyed the scene before her. For the first time that day, the world didn't feel so overwhelming. The crowd no longer felt like a faceless blur. She had made a difference, at least in her own small way. Her art had mattered. And then, just as she was packing up, a familiar voice called out from across the sidewalk. "Hey, kid!" Sophie froze, recognizing the gravelly tone immediately. She turned to see Clint Eastwood standing there again, looking like he'd just stepped off a movie set. He was holding a coffee cup in his hand, his expression still unreadable, but there was a hint of something softer in his eyes. "I just wanted to check in on you," he said, his voice casual, as if it were nothing. "I was passing by and saw you still here." Sophie blinked, momentarily stunned. Clint Eastwood coming back to check on her? It didn't seem real. Thanks for stopping by," she stammered, unsure what to say next. Clint nodded, glancing at her booth. "You've got a good thing going here," he said. "Keep it up, people will notice." Sophie didn't know how to respond. Her heart was racing, and she struggled to keep her composure. "You've got a second chance," he said, his voice more serious now. "Don't waste it." Before she could even gather her thoughts, Clint turned to leave, disappearing into the crowd once again. But this time, Sophie didn't feel the same sense of quiet loneliness she had felt before. His words lingered in her mind. "You've got a second chance. Don't waste it." Sophie stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the paintings she had sold. It was the belief that someone, even if only for a moment, saw her for who she truly was. A fighter, an artist, a woman who had something to give. With renewed strength in her heart, Sophie packed up the last of her things, feeling a spark of hope like she hadn't felt in months. Maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe the journey ahead would still be long, filled with more uncertainty and struggle. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Sophie didn't feel like she was fighting alone. She was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a blur of color, paint, and new beginnings. Sophie had begun to understand that this wasn't just about selling art anymore. It was a battle for her life, a fight against something far bigger than herself. Every brushstroke became an act of defiance. Every color she mixed a challenge to the world that had almost broken her. Her art stand had become a part of the city's rhythm. At first, people had walked past with barely a glance, but now there were those who stopped. They didn't just see her paintings. They saw her. Sophie, the girl with cancer, yes, but also the girl with a story to tell, a talent to share, and a will to fight that could not be ignored. The hospital visits continued. The treatments were still expensive, the bills still piled up. But now there was a sense of urgency to her work. She painted like every stroke could be her last. And when the days felt impossibly long, when the fatigue threatened to consume her, she reminded herself that the fight wasn't just for survival. It was for something bigger, a future she could hold on to. One afternoon, after a grueling round of chemotherapy that had left her exhausted and pale, Sophie sat at her booth, too tired to stand, but unwilling to leave. She had just finished a piece she was particularly proud of, a deep, swirling blue ocean scene, the waves crashing against the rocks as if to defy the tide. She had painted it with every ounce of energy she could muster. It was her victory over the exhaustion, her triumph over the pain. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid it out on the table, hoping someone would see it, someone would recognize the story she had poured into it. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and Sophie was starting to wonder if she should pack up for the night. But then, just as she was about to lift the canvas, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "This one," the voice said, low and confident. Sophie looked up to see a man standing in front of her booth. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, dark suit with a tie that matched the stormy hues in her ocean painting. His eyes were piercing, calculating, like a man who had spent his life analyzing everything in front of him. But when he looked at the painting, there was something different in his gaze, a recognition, as though he understood what she was trying to say without her needing to explain it. He reached for the painting with a slow, deliberate movement, his fingers brushing lightly against the canvas, almost reverently. "How much for this one?" he asked, his voice steady. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected anyone to stop so suddenly, especially not someone like him, someone who looked so polished. She quickly gathered her thoughts, but the price felt too small to say out loud, even though she knew it was what she had decided. $80, she said quietly, her voice shaky, unsure of how this interaction was going to unfold. The man paused for a moment, as though weighing her words, then nodded. "I'll take it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. He's buying it. Just like that? But before she could process what was happening, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to her with no hesitation. "Keep the change," he said, his voice still calm, but with a certain authority that made her feel like this wasn't just a transaction. It was an acknowledgement. Sophie took the money, feeling her hands tremble again, this time from the intensity of the moment. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply nodded, watching him as he carefully wrapped the painting in paper and walked away. He didn't even offer her a look back, Just like Clint Eastwood before him, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sophie standing there, feeling like the ground beneath her was shifting. For the next few moments, she stood there, staring at the space where her painting had once been. The $100 bill felt like a weight in her hand, but it was more than just the money. It was a signal, a sign that she was on the right path. Her hands clutched the bills tightly as she stood still, not wanting to move just yet, not wanting to let the moment slip away. This was no longer just about survival. This was about creating something that mattered, something that would outlast the pain, something that was bigger than the cancer, bigger than the fight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Sophie packed up her stand, still holding the $100 bill in her hand. She felt like she could breathe a little easier tonight. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks, the sound of her heartbeat steady and strong, echoing the rhythm of her renewed hope. The next morning, as Sophie made her way to the hospital for another round of treatment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Maybe it was the money in her pocket. Maybe it was the unexpected kindness from strangers. Or maybe it was the quiet, unspoken belief that had started to take root in her soul. That she was not just fighting for a second chance at life, but for something more. That afternoon, her booth was busier than usual. The crowd had begun to grow, drawn in by the energy she had found. They didn't just look at her paintings anymore. They looked at her. They saw the struggle, the fight, the passion behind the canvas. And with each person who stopped, each person who bought a painting, or simply took the time to listen, Sophie felt the pieces of herself that had been broken begin to stitch together. She wasn't sure what the future held. She couldn't afford to think too far ahead. But in that moment, as the city pulsed around her, Sophie knew one thing for sure. She had found her purpose, and nothing was going to take that away. The days grew shorter as autumn crept in, painting the world in golden hues and crisp air. Sophie's art stand had become a fixture in the downtown district, a symbol of resilience and transformation. The once quiet corner, where a girl fought for her survival through the strokes of a brush, was now bustling with customers, admirers, and curious onlookers. But what had started as a desperate act of survival had slowly evolved into something much greater, a journey toward rediscovering herself, her purpose, and her strength. Her paintings were no longer just about paying medical bills. They had become a voice for her story, her pain, and her hope. Sophie had learned that art was not just an escape, but a bridge between her heart and the world, between her struggle and others' understanding. People weren't just buying her work. They were buying into the belief that she could overcome the odds. They believed in her. One particularly cold afternoon, as Sophie carefully arranged her paintings, a familiar face appeared at her booth. It was Clint Eastwood, though this time there was no movie star swagger, no paparazzi flash, just a man walking through the crowd, looking slightly older and more tired, but with the same calm demeanor that had first drawn Sophie to him. "Still here?" he asked, his voice carrying the same calm assurance that had stayed with Sophie in her darkest moments. She looked up, smiling despite the fatigue settling deep into her bones. "Yeah, still here. Still painting." Clint nodded, glancing at the paintings in front of him. His eyes moved across each one, stopping for a moment longer on a piece she had just finished. A vibrant landscape of a red sky meeting the ocean, a scene that symbolized the conflict and peace she felt within herself. "I like that one," he said after a long pause, his eyes softening. "It feels like you found your way back." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It had taken so long for her to feel like she had. The months of treatments, the unrelenting fatigue, the uncertainty about what the future held. And yet, here she was, alive, stronger, and creating something that mattered. "Maybe," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think maybe I'm starting to find my way." Clint smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "You were always going to find it. You just had to keep going." They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the paintings, but the weight of their conversation hung in the air. "I came by to say something," Clint continued, his tone more serious now. "I'm not the kind of guy who usually does this. But I've seen something in you. Something that doesn't just survive, but thrives. I know your story, Sophie. I know what you've been through. And I'm proud of you. You're fighting for yourself, yes. but you're also giving people something to believe in. Don't let that go." Sophie blinked, taken aback by the intensity of his words. She had never thought of herself as someone who could inspire, let alone give people something to believe in. She had always thought she was just a girl trying to stay afloat. "I thank you," she said softly, overwhelmed by the weight of his praise. "That means more to me than you know." Clint nodded and looked at her one last time before turning to leave, as effortlessly as he had come. "Keep painting, Sophie. You've got a gift, and the world needs it." As Sophie stood there, watching him disappear into the crowd, a wave of realization washed over her. She had spent so much of her life fighting for survival, fighting for another day, another breath, but now she was fighting for something more. She was fighting for her story, for the message that her journey had carved into her soul. She was fighting to create, to live, to leave behind something that mattered. Sophie packed up her stand that evening, but the weight of her thoughts stayed with her. She had gone through hell and come out the other side, still holding her brushes, still holding her dreams. She had fought not just for life, but for the future she wanted to create, and now she knew she was not alone in this battle. There were others, like Clint, who believed in her, even when she had lost sight of herself. The lesson. The journey Sophie had been on wasn't just about overcoming illness. It was about understanding that the fight for survival could also be the fight to live fully. Through the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, Sophie had learned that her art was not just a means to an end. It was her way of transforming her struggles into something beautiful and meaningful. In the end, the lesson Sophie learned wasn't just about how to keep fighting for another day. It was about fighting to live the way she wanted, to create, to leave behind something that would outlast her struggle. Her story, her fight, had turned into something that could inspire others, just as Clint had inspired her. Sometimes the world doesn't recognize your worth at first, but when you keep pushing forward, when you keep creating, even through the hardest times, you find that not only do you change your own life, you change the lives of others too. And when it feels like the world has forgotten you, when you feel invisible, there's always the possibility that someone will notice. Someone will see the fight in you and remind you that yes, you matter. You are not just surviving. You are living, and your story is worth telling. Sophie knew now that she didn't need to wait for a miracle. She was the miracle.